joining our webinar, How to Transition Your Emergency Shelter to a Low-Barrier Housing-Focused Model. We're going to get started, and I'm going to just start us off with a little logistics about today's webinar. If you could go to the next slide, Cynthia. So you're all on mute as usual, but we do want to hear from you. So if you could pose questions that you have at any time in the questions box. There's almost 1,000 people signed up for this webinar today, so we're not sure we're going to get to all of them, but we are collecting them, and it does help inform our shelter webinar series to hear what you guys are wondering about. So please don't be shy, enter your questions in at any time in the questions box. But I'll go ahead and answer one question right now that you probably all have, which is yes, this webinar is being recorded, and we will post the recording and the slides on our website, endhomelessness.org, as soon as possible after the webinar is over. So with that, I'll turn it over to Cynthia Nagendra, the Director of the Center for Capacity Building here at the Alliance, to introduce our speakers for the webinar today.
Thank you, Anna. I am Cynthia Nagendra, and if you've been listening to this webinar series, this is the third in our Emergency Shelter Learning Series. I'm the Director of the Alliance's Center for Capacity Building. I'm really just thrilled to be joined today by my fabulous colleague Anna Blasco, who's our Technical Assistance Specialist, but we're also joined by three amazing and very wise providers from across the country, and we're mostly going to be hearing from them today in what's going to be really a panel discussion about their experience working through the transition of moving to a low-barrier housing-focused model of shelter, and really the difficult challenges that they have faced and how they got through them. So today we are joined by Deirdre DiCara from FISH, which is Friends in Service to Humanity of Northwestern Connecticut. We are also joined by Kris Freed of LA Family Housing and John McDonald of Crossroads Rhode Island. And they're going to each tell you a little bit about their program, so you kind of get a sense for who they serve, where they are, and the scope of their shelter. We're so excited to be delivering you this third installment of the Alliance's Emergency Shelter Learning Series. And if you've attended or listened to the recording of the first and second webinar, thanks for coming back. If this is your first time that you haven't missed anything, you can go back and listen to the recording, but you're still going to get a lot out of today's discussion. We also have sent out a number of resources on our website and through these webinar series. Here we have the 5 the shelter self-assessment and action plans that correspond to each of the 5 key elements of shelter that we have been talking about. So feel free to download them right here from the handout section of the webinar on your control panel. And if you want to see all of the resources that we have been putting out, you can go to our Emergency Shelter Learning Series, which is a little bit hidden on this page. I'll go to the next slide there so you can see it. This is where our resources are for the Emergency Shelter Learning Series. You will also notice that we have launched a new website today, so it will look a little bit different than our website has in the past. Hopefully it looks a lot better and a lot easier to navigate. So welcome to our new website. Please check out this page. There are a lot of resources there. The recorded webinars are there, and we will also be putting new resources up. You'll also find the infographic on shelter that you can just download and have for your staff. So we also have sent out a survey over the last couple of months, and almost hundreds of people have filled out this survey on how they're doing, where they are, and really what their biggest challenges are. Last month we sent out a question, what are your biggest challenges? Hundreds of people responded. We took those challenges and those questions, and we used them to inform our discussion today. So we'll be actually pulling from actual questions that you all asked in the series, and we've also kind of summarized some of the more similar questions for our panelists, and so hopefully we're going to be really covering a lot of the questions and challenges that you all actually posed to us in the last couple of months. And if you're new to the series, I encourage you to go back and listen to the previous webinars. I think they'll be really helpful. And again, as I always have in the last couple of webinars, I want to acknowledge that what you're doing is one of the most difficult jobs that there is, and I'm sure we're going to hear more about that from our panelists today. Running an emergency shelter, operating an emergency shelter, being on the front lines is incredibly critical to your community's success in ending homelessness, and the work you do is life-saving and so important. This series is really meant to help you build on what you're doing and on your expertise and help you serve your folks better. And we are just so glad that you're here. The Shelter's Learning Series goals are overall to strengthen shelter policies and services to improve the housing outcomes for people experiencing homelessness across your crisis response system. And housing outcomes may not be something you've been measuring in the past. We did give you a set of shelter metrics to look at last month. Those are also on our webpage. So if you want to look more at how to look at housing outcomes, there's a good sort of set of metrics that might be helpful to you. We also are hoping that you will implement a system-wide approach to ending homelessness that includes emergency shelters. Emergency shelters have been a little bit siloed from some of the systems change processes happening in communities, and that's not really blame there. It's just that shelters have been sort of the immediate response to homelessness for so many years. And, you know, with this focus on housing and permanent housing and systems change and coordinated entry, shelters have not had as much guidance given to them, and we're really hoping that this helps include shelters and integrate them into the larger systems change. We're hoping to align emergency shelter goals with the community's goals to end homelessness. This is really key. Again, shelters are critical to ending homelessness because they really impact how the system works. And we're hoping that this series will also help you provide low barrier, safe, and housing-focused shelter. So over the next few months, we want to not just provide information, but also guide shelters to action and accomplish the following activities during the course of the series so that you may build on the work that you're already doing. Many of you are already well underway in doing this work. You're already there, and you're really just looking how to improve. And some of you are making really drastic changes. And we want to make sure that we're not just providing information, but guiding you on how to make these changes. To sort of respond to homelessness better and align your shelters with these practices. And so over the coming months, we have talked about understanding, in the past few months, we've talked about understanding the role of shelter in a crisis response system in Webinar 1, assessing how your shelter currently aligns with the key elements to effective emergency shelter in Webinar 2. Today we're going to be focusing on hearing from providers on how to really implement these key elements to effective emergency shelter. Really, how do you operationalize them? How do you work through the difficult challenges? How do you bring staff on board? Things like that. In the future, we're going to talk more about developing goals and action plans. The things that are handouts in our panel there are going to help you sort of set those action plans, track shelter metrics, and establish benchmarks to improve outcomes. We're going to offer a variety of tools. As I said before, I think I've covered most of these, a series of webinars, some self-assessments, tools, and guidance from shelters. And again, you can find all of that on the website link that we provided earlier. And yes, we will be posting this webinar, so you can see that again. You can also just go to our website and do a search bar for Emergency Shelter Learning Series, and it will take you there. So with that, we are going to go to a poll question that we have been asking throughout the series because we're sort of measuring where people are moving through this process. I'm going to hand it over to Anna.
Okay, so you should see a poll right now about where you are in your transformational change. This is asking kind of how you're sort of feeling as we enter this webinar. Are you recognizing the need for change? Are you feeling confusion, anxiety, or loss? Do you have clarity and new vision for change? And are you already integrating and restructuring in response to change? So I see only about 27% of folks have voted. So if you could just click into the webinar and tell us how you feel. This is anonymous, so don't worry, we won't be checking up on folks who aren't feeling new vision. So only about 50% of people have voted. So please just take a quick second and let us know how you're feeling. Okay, just going to wait for a couple more people, and then I will share the results. Okay, so it looks like 43% of you are integrating and restructuring in response to change, so folks are already kind of working on that. And then the second highest is recognizing the need for change. So we have a lot of folks at the end of the transformational change spectrum and a lot of folks at the beginning of the spectrum, which is really interesting. Thank you so much for letting us know where you're all at.
It also looks like people are really moving towards the integrating and restructuring in response. So that's pretty exciting. I think we have a lot more folks on the sort of left side of this curve, you know, of feeling confusion, anxiety, loss. And again, I think we're going to hear a lot from our panelists today, and I think this is why it's going to be so powerful to hear from them today, because the feeling of confusion, anxiety, loss is very much part of this process, especially for your frontline staff who've been doing this for a really long time. And for program directors and boards and your community, this is, it can feel really anxiety-provoking before you really get to the part where you're integrating this new vision and feel really confident about it and seeing the positive effects of change. So I want to just really acknowledge that if that's what you're feeling right now, that's completely normal. So we see like about only 5% of people in the anxiety loss stage, so that's good. Looks like people are moving through it. Or maybe people are really going to therapy and just really working through this stuff and just feeling a lot better. So with that, I'm going to start introducing our panelists and let them tell you a little bit about each of their shelters so you can kind of get a sense from where they're coming from and what their experience is. I'm going to start with Kris Freed from LA Family Housing. And Kris, please take it away, tell them what your role is and a little bit about your shelter.
Can you hear me? Can I just?
Yes.
Yes.
We can hear you.
Awesome. So good morning or afternoon, depending on where you are in the country. I am in the beautiful and very warm today, Los Angeles. And so that's the first slide there is just basically a little bit about our mission and who we are. You can hit this slide. I'll just talk as I go. But LA Family Housing, in many regards, is a continuum within a continuum. We have everything from the lead of, we're the lead agency for both individuals and families in coordinated entry. And then we have emergency, or rather, we call it crisis housing and bridge housing in Los Angeles. And then we are also an affordable housing developer and permanent supportive housing developer. And so we're kind of a continuum within a continuum. This slide that we're on right now just basically gives a snapshot of the different types of services that we provide over the year, but I think the next slide is probably just the most important in terms of our conversation today. And so just to give you scope and scale of what we do here. So we own and operate a 250-person shelter, 27-unit family program, a 12-unit family shelter, a 9-unit shelter, but we also manage the beds because in Los Angeles, we are responsible as a coordinated lead for managing as many of our partner agencies' beds on crisis and bridge housing throughout our regions. And so we have 25 units through our collaborative partners in addition to other beds that aren't necessarily funded. And then we manage up to 60 units per night of motel placement for both families and individuals. And in the following bullet point, the one thing that I forgot to put in there, which is critically important is that we operate from a housing first model. All of our placements that go into shelter come from our coordinated system and they're prioritized by the highest of acuity. We're required to be open 24 hours a day, so there is no close during the morning. And then in terms of rules, we've really tried to reduce the rules that we have, and so that we're revolving just everything about exit only, if you're being exited, that it's only about safety and security of yourself and or of the other participants. And of course, we operate from a harm reduction model. And that is who we are.
Thank you, Kris. I know we're going to hear a lot more about how all of that comes together, so thank you. And our next speaker is John McDonald from Crossroads, Rhode Island.
Good afternoon, good morning. So you're going from the largest state to the smallest state. Crossroads Rhode Island is the largest provider of homeless services in the state of Rhode Island. And very much like Kris out in LA, we provide a continuum. We have, in terms of families, we provide more than 30 units for families in shelter. We have more than 125 shelter beds for men and 50 for women. So in terms of scale, we're very much smaller than LA, but we provide shelter, both families, individuals, and we also operated a domestic violence shelter. We have also more than 350 units of housing that we have across the state. So we, the next slide, actually maybe skip through this one, and then this is a little bit about how we changed from a traditional continuum model to very much a housing first agency. And we were the first agency in the state of Rhode Island to adopt that policy. And we've been helping, motivating, moving, cajoling our other providers along in that process, and very much have most providers across the state very engaged in a housing first model, and we have seen some great results as a result of that change. The next slide talks a little bit about our what we've been able to achieve since making those changes, and it has been very much about getting folks into housing as quickly as possible. And we've seen increases over the last couple of years in our placements and in the reduction of our lengths of stay. I can go into lots of other stuff, but I think that gives you the quick snapshot.
Okay. Thank you, John. I look forward to hearing more from you as well. And I want to say both about Kris and John, we've learned so much from both of their shelters, and a lot from Deirdre, who is about to talk to you a little bit about her shelter.
Greetings around the country. I am Deirdre, calling from FISH, Friends in Service to Humanity of Northwestern Connecticut, and we are a rural area council shelter. And so we have a 35-bed shelter, which last year we housed a total of 112 individuals, families, and veterans, with our diversity being aged. Right now we have a 3-month-old baby that was born into the shelter, as well as right into the 70s, senior citizens. What was wonderful, since we, in Connecticut, we have been very focused on ending veterans' chronic homelessness and chronic homelessness in general. And Connecticut would say that we were #1 in doing both. So we've had a wonderful collaboration going on of not using the 2-on-1 process, the CAN system, of course, for the network for assigning folks to shelter, but really how to house people quickly. And so it's a real collaboration of many, many agencies around the state that work with us, providing all types of services to our folks, but particularly getting them into housing. So last year, of the 112, we housed 72 individuals, which represented 60 households. So we had a 95% success rate of housing people. We also provide supportive services. So we are doing GED classes and all types of other services right here under our roof, doctor, medical care, all of that comes right into our shelter. Last year, we're a double operation. Besides the shelter, we have a food pantry. And so last year we had over 2,000 folks registered with the food pantry, which represented over 500 families, as you can see. And we provided enough food for over 115,000 meals. The need is tremendous here, and it's surprising, I think, when you think you're in the state of Connecticut. But we're a rural corner where it used to, the focus was always manufacturing, and that's not the case any longer. So we really are looking to change people's lives for the positive that are facing life crisis.
Thank you, Deirdre. And I wanted to, I think something that you mentioned, I hope will come out a lot more in this webinar, is how much collaboration you're all doing in your communities, because shelter really can't be everything to everybody. And I think all of you have, created amazing partnerships in your communities. And I'm just really excited that there's such a variety of experience here. And I think that hopefully that will really speak to the broad range of folks we have listening on the webinar. So with that, I want to talk, I want to move right into discussion questions and your challenges. So what we're going to do is start off with some discussion questions for our panelists. And some of these, as I said, are common questions that we've been getting a lot of, we've gotten a lot. And some of these are questions that are straight from the surveys that you, the audience, responded with in the last month or so. So I'm going to just show you a word cloud that shows a response to: share in 100 words or less your biggest challenge when it comes to providing low barrier shelter. And about 122 people out there answered this. And as you can see, I think a lot of you had a lot of the same challenges. You know, it looks like space, drug and alcohol issues, how do you, oops, sorry about that, low barrier shelter when you are working with people who are sober and not sober, staffing, housing being available, how do you serve families, and how do you serve people with criminal backgrounds. So that's a lot of the stuff that we has us informed the way that we're going to sort of ask questions today. If you have questions that you don't see being answered, please feel free to put questions in the chat box. If we don't get to them today, we will certainly try to respond to them in future webinars. So my first question for our panelists is, or it's kind of a series of questions here, but first, why did you decide to make a change to your shelter model? What were some of those biggest changes that you made? And how would you describe the impact of those changes on the people you serve? And John, John from Crossroads Rhode Island, I'd like to start with you, if that's okay.
Sure, sure. So, because my boss told me, that's why.
I think that's fair.
When two of the women on our leadership team, two key folks, went down to the National Alliances Conference 3-4 years ago, they came back having sat through one of OrgCode's, Ian DeYoung's his presentations, and they came back overwhelmed with the evidence that said changing from our current continuum model to a housing-focused, housing-first model can have a dramatic change in our outcomes and get people out of shelter a lot more quickly. That was the key, the kind of crucial moment where we shifted, and from their attending the conference in Washington to within a couple months, we had a series of meetings with staff, with state officials, and that's what got the ball rolling.
And what were some of the biggest changes you made, if you were to summarize them?
Well, we changed everything from job descriptions for staff. We did a reorganization of the entire agency, so more than 125 people. We brought the board on right at the beginning because it needed to be top to bottom, inside and out change, and everyone had to buy in. So changing job descriptions and expectations of staff, that was huge. And then really listening to the men and women, the families who are staying in our shelters, and saying, okay, this is where we're going. What are your thoughts? What's your input? We did a series of focus groups with folks, and one of the biggest changes as a result of that was taking our guidelines, our rule books, all that, from pages and pages down to some very small, in some cases, 7 expectations. That's it.
And were you testing for drugs and alcohol before, and did that change?
So we allowed folks to come in who were intoxicated, who were using. Obviously, they could not do that inside the shelters, but if someone could safely negotiate the shelter, they were allowed to come in. And that had been the case before, but we have, in working with staff and working with our shelter users, taken something that was 2 weeks out if you came in really intoxicated and, you know, got belligerent, to, okay, maybe this evening you need to be out. You know, maybe this evening you need to spend at the hospital to make sure you're safe to come back tomorrow. But it reduced the consequences significantly.
And how would you describe the impact of those changes generally on the people you serve?
So there was a real change in people's attitude because, you know, they were very used to having, you know, staff say, okay, you know, you've been a pain in the neck tonight, you're out for 2 weeks or a month, to, listen, this evening, you know, it looks like you're not going to be able to manage. Come back tomorrow and let's try again. Having staff be open, you know, and very transparent with clients was incredibly important, and the men and women were very open to that. The families, it was a very punitive approach that we took and to have families and engage in discussions with staff about, okay, so we're having a problem here. Let's, sit down and talk through and problem solve what we can do to keep you in shelter rather than, get you out of shelter. So screening people in rather than screening people out.
And I'm going to want to probably dig into a little bit more about how you went from being punitive to focusing on other behaviors, but I'm going to come back to that in a later question because I know that's a really important thing that people really want to hear more about.
Sure.
Thank you, John. Deirdre, I would like to ask you the same questions. Why did you decide to make a change to your shelter model, and what were some of the biggest changes you made?
Well, first of all, we've been a low barrier shelter for over a year, and I can assure everybody it does work. But I will tell you that when we learned that it would affect our funding, which to have the shelter budget is half from the Department of Housing and HUD funds, that was what led us to become a low barrier shelter. And it was difficult. I mean, I had to make the proposal to become a low barrier shelter to my board, and their reaction immediately was, we're going to close the shelter because we have children, we have seniors, we can't possibly drop breathalyzing, we can't drop drug testing. But instead, as executive, I presented our homeless mission statement to them, and I said, this is a much greater issue than our shelter alone. This really belongs to our greater community. And so we held a meeting, and that meeting included our local mayors, our legislators, our attorney, our greatest funders, our local community foundation, our United Way, so all gathered with my board of directors and with my 2 case managers, and everyone by the end of the meeting knew that we all had to feel ownership for working with our homeless in our community. It was beyond fish. We all had to care and take action. So fortunately, we were blessed to become a part of a learning collaborative in Connecticut with 4 other homeless shelters sponsored by you all at the National Alliance to End Homelessness. And that made our big difference because we just didn't do this half-heartedly. We went cold turkey, and within a couple of months, we were no longer doing any testing. I had rewritten all of the agency's policies and rules for the shelter, and what we learned about in class was what we called the Marvin rules, and so many of the rules of the shelter were, you had one incident and then you had a million rules about it. So now we are very basic, all about behavior. So everyone is judged on their behavior and they know what our expectations are. But the goal is to remain the family-friendly, warm, caring shelter that we are, because when folks move into fish, unlike many shelters, you move in until we house you unless there's an issue. So you have your nesting space, you feel a part of the fish family. And that's, people really, the shelter residents have, on the great majority, caring for each other, and they really work with us with the goal of getting them into housing and what resources we can provide them with to be successful when they leave. And I'll tell you, the success, we have every holiday imaginable in our shelter because it is a family. And I invite former residents back, let's say for Memorial Day. We march in the Memorial Day parade, and then we throw a barbecue. We have 35 residents. Over 60 people returned to come to our barbecue. So it shows it's working, and that there's I think there's a trust with each other, that people care enough that they want a success and they want a safe place to live. It was a challenge with staff, know that, and we're tested, don't think we aren't, but we make an example of someone and then that sets the tone for in the shelter life.
And Deirdre, you touched on this a little bit, but how would you describe the impact of these changes? I mean, going from a program that was testing folks regularly for drugs and alcohol use to a low barrier, more housing focused shelter, how would you describe the impact of those changes on the people you serve?
Well, I did a house meeting and I talked about it, and we went over the new rules, and we talked about the changes to behavioral issues. And believe me, at the beginning, we were tested. And we now, though, being a low barrier shelter, if someone comes to the door and you know that they've imbibed or they're under an influence, they're sent right to their bedroom, or we've created a room in the house where if we had to have a watch over someone, we can do so. But if they come in a state that's not acceptable at the door, they're not allowed in. We're not going to expose everybody that fights every day to remain sober. And, if they can't head right to their bed, then they have to not enter the shelter until they're prepared to do so.
And it sounds like, I know, Deirdre, I know with your shelter, and I think this is true for the other panelists, but for you, I know in particular, you didn't do this with any new resources. You didn't do this with any new staff, and you had a pretty resource-scarce environment. So I think I just wanted to point that out. We can sort of hear a little bit more later about how you did that, but I wanted to point that out. And also point out that you set some very clear outcome goals for yourself, that in 6 months you were going to reduce your length of stay by 10%, you were going to increase your exits to housing by 25%, you were going to change all of your policies around substance use. So, I wanted to say that it's pretty amazing how quickly, within 3 to 6 months, you were able to make those changes with no extra resources.
It's true. Absolutely
and
true.
And it's pretty amazing. And I wanted to point out, too, to other folks who are listening, the Alliance was part of this, but, you definitely don't need us to be able to make these changes. That's why we're trying to put a lot of these resources out there. But I do appreciate the shout out, Deirdre. So I'm going to move on to our next question. And the next question is, how did your staff, and you can be really honest about this here, but keep it PG. How did your staff feel about making these changes to be a low barrier model of shelter? How did you get them through the changes of becoming a low barrier shelter? And how does staff feel now? And Kris, I thought I would start with you here.
Thank you. So how did staff feel about making changes to become a low barrier shelter? So we've actually been operating in this manner for about 3.5 years. And I think the original thought was that we had some really long-term staff, some staff upward of 12, 13 years. And it was extremely challenging because things were always coming from a place of being rule-based and control-based. And to give that up because it was the right thing to do, because making homeless people that were experiencing homelessness homeless again by throwing them out because they couldn't follow rules just didn't feel right. And so it wasn't necessarily a really smooth process in the very early stages. What we did in order to address that was brought in training from around the country. And of course, Ian is probably in ORCODE, probably the most well known for this. But we brought him in first, primarily because of his personality, to be able to really engage folks, and it worked for a significant portion of our team. And then from there, he helped us identify some momentum going forward. And I know this isn't necessarily I'm not out putting plugs in terms of Ian, poor Ian, but I think it's critically important to say that he was really on one of the front ends of this, and working with NAH to do that, to help us identify what we needed to be doing. And I know that that we just heard about the Marvin Rule, and that's something I stole from Cynthia. And Cynthia, I don't know if you got it from somewhere else, but it was really about getting rid of all those one-time rules, because Marvin was smoking in the bathroom and he lit the place on fire, so you're never going to have a lighter in the facility again. So really just having the stuff around safety. I would say that that during this transition we lost staff, and my advice would be, or opinion would be, that that's not always a bad thing. Sometimes people have a really hard time with this transition, but if they can't do it and they're not willing to get to this point, they might not be the right fit for where we're trying to head when you're working with a really difficult population. And so I would say, how do we feel about it now? I have a team that's 100% supportive of what we do. That doesn't mean that questions don't come up. Doesn't mean that when somebody comes back and they've said something really horrible to a staff person, that staff don't all send emails about, well, what's our limit? But I think that for the most part, we're able to have those conversations around where our limitations are, being very clear on what those boundaries are and when the line has been crossed. And also being able to say that if somebody crossed the line today, maybe they're out today, but it doesn't mean they can't come back tomorrow. It doesn't mean that they're completely exited and we won't work with them. And so it's having those conversations, keeping an open line of communication with staff, allowing them to vent their frustrations, and also provide a level of support for them as well so that they can vent those frustrations in a safe place and not worry about that because they were upset about one particular incident that potentially their job is on the line. So I think we're in a really good place now. Our staff, we have, just for scale again, LA Family Housing, we're at about 200 right now. And so anybody who works with the shelters, around the shelters, they're all coming from the same lens in terms of the way that we operate.
So Kris, I wanted to follow up on a couple of things you said. First, yes, the Marvin Rule is something we talked about in our last webinar, and it is meant to sort of help everyone who has shelter rules look through their rules to really see why do we have each rule? Is there a rule that is really based on one person that was here ages ago, or is here now that we don't need for everybody? And we'll talk more about rules on an upcoming webinar. So thanks for it is someone based on someone I know, so that's where that came from. But also, and Ian from Org Code, Ian DeYoung, has also helped really shape a lot of our work. So I wanted to thank their experience as well. And I wanted to follow up on a couple things you said, which is, I didn't ask you this exact question, but, what are some of the biggest changes you made, and what were staff's biggest fears?
I think some of the biggest changes that we made, and we'll talk about this a little bit later, but one of the main changes that we made around making, so you're talking about staff specifically, yes? Or are you just talking about in general for the shelter itself? So some of the
both, yeah.
Okay, so about staff, one of the things, and we'll talk about it even, I think, more in depth a little bit later, was we completely reorganized our staffing model and created a more functional model around the different services that we provide. And so, and in doing that, then we aligned staff where it made the most sense and where their strengths were, and so that they weren't being put in a position necessarily to fail. So that's that about that. Around making the changes for the shelter itself was, I think it just comes back to the very to the question that you asked previously in the last slide, which was, why do we decide to go to this model? And so it helped lead us to the changes. And the reason we decided to go to this model was, why were we making homeless people homeless again? It just didn't make sense. If our goal was really to help those that are are most challenged, then we needed to figure out how to be able to support them while they were in shelter. And so we just ripped up all the rules, and we got everybody in a room and said, what are the most important components about allowing people in? Why do we need to drug test people? What purpose does that serve? And in saying that, we also have child safety, because we operate a lot of family shelters, so it's not like we're ignoring the fact that people may be using, but we're assessing each situation independent of one another. They're not all the same. And so we needed to make good decisions around safety and security of kids, but not throwing everyone into one bucket, saying because they use, they can't potentially be great parents, or they can't supervise their kids, and therefore we're going to kick them out or report them to the Department of, in LA, the Department of Children and Family Services. So it was really about getting people in the room, figuring out what we could live with and what we couldn't, and really then changing our job function and descriptions around that. And really, we have this little statement on all of our job applications, which basically, I'm not stating it exactly, but it's basically around, you know, you have to have a level of thick skin to be able to work in this environment. You cannot allow what people say, you know, the sticks and stones, to affect your ability to work with somebody. So I hope that answers your question.
No, that's fantastic. It's really helpful. And I think that we will touch on a few more things you said in a little bit. But I wanted to point out a couple of things that I think are really important, which is, and all of the panelists have mentioned this word, I think, which is safety. Safety is still at very much the center of what you are all doing. So having a low barrier shelter where you have mixed populations does not mean that you're sacrificing anyone's staff or client safety, especially if you're serving children. And so I think I do really want to come back to that. So thank you. And also another really key thing that you said was, you know, staff sort of being afraid about outcomes. When we talk about this new model, we really want to make sure that people are still, you know, serving the most vulnerable people they can, the people who need shelter the most, the people who are not going to be able to survive without it. And if that means that, you know, a lot of people will ask us, well, doesn't that mean our housing outcomes are going to be worse? Well, and this is where your funders and your board should really be involved as well, which is, yes, your outcomes for housing might be a little bit unsteady, although most of the time we see our housing outcomes improve because staff have changed their job functions and activities. But yes, your outcomes might be a little bit different or lower than because you're serving maybe a more vulnerable population, but that's okay, especially if you are still housing most of those people, or it might take a little bit longer, or you might be, you know, working with people differently. But it's important not to feel like you have to have the best outcomes, which means you have to serve people who are, quote unquote, you know, more housable. We still want to be serving the absolutely most vulnerable. So thank you, Kris. And so I wanted to turn this question to John. How did your staff feel about making these changes? And how did you get them through that, and how do they feel now?
Well, safety, I'm glad you brought that up again. And Crossroads has three values: safety, respect, and effectiveness. And staff at the beginning was very, very concerned about safety. They wanted to know that they weren't going to become doormats or things like that. So right from the beginning, we addressed the training need and began working with staff around trauma-informed care and used CPI, crisis prevention and intervention, and made that available for all staff so that they felt that they had the skills and resources to deal with issues that came up, and as things started to escalate, they felt capable, they felt like they could intervene in a safe manner and have outcomes where they weren't asking people, as they had in the past, to leave, but felt capable of dealing with folks as they really got angry and could give people options and have a better outcome. So at the beginning, there was lots of hesitation, lots of trepidation, and like Kris, we did lose some staff. There was no question that there were folks who didn't possess or weren't able to develop that thicker skin and not personalize the way that the old rules and the old interventions allowed them to say, you're out for 2 weeks, you're out for a month. But to develop an ability to really not personalize it when someone, you know, was just venting for a minute and had a bad day, and really help staff to be able to let that wash right over them, but intervene when, you know, something started to escalate. And we have multiple facilities, and in our main facility we have individuals and we serve families. So at that location, it was very, very important to look at and train staff and give them the skills and resources so they felt capable and able to intervene and not have things get out of control. So I would say that staff now feel very good, empowered. Just a year ago, we took over our largest shelter. We took over from another provider, and we were able to place 5 people in housing early on who had more than 40 years of homelessness between them. And having that early win, that early gain, really helped to get staff on board and say, wow, this model does really work. But also all the men who were there to say, gee, yeah, one of the biggest opponents to our managing that program, was one of the first people that we placed, and he became a real strong advocate, and was, when he told me how thankful, was just tearful, saying, I can't believe this, thanks so much, I didn't believe it could happen. So having some early gains, having staff see the benefits, of concrete benefits of this changed model, and giving them skills to really do their work was what was crucial.
I think that's such great advice. I mean, it's certainly one thing I want to repeat that you said was that you have these 3 values that I think really help you come back to how to think about your policies and how and your operations with safety, respect, and effectiveness. And I think that your staff has told me that you go back to that kind of time and again when you're thinking about situations and how to respond to them. And it kind of makes it easier to remember those values. And I think the other thing that I've heard a lot in the work we've done with shelters, and it seems to sort of resonate with your experience, which is that staff often are afraid that changing the rules, or if they feel like taking away a lot of the rules, means that they're not going to be able to sort of control the environment, that things, basically all hell is going to break loose is what I've heard a lot, and that people feel that the rules, staff especially, and clients too, feel that the rules keep everyone kind of safe. And I've heard from staff that have made this transition that actually making the transition helped them feel like they were no longer monitors or kind of wardens of the shelter, to people who are actually partners with clients, and it sort of actually changed the power dynamic that existed to something that felt more like a partnership. It wasn't about writing clients up. It was about kind of partnering and collaborating with clients who, to get to the same goal. Staff and clients should have about the same goal. And does that sound like something that you kind of experienced in your shelter?
Oh, that is so spot on. So in particular, in that large men's shelter, the culture we really addressed, and part of this the credit goes to the shelter manager who's there. She really created a partnership and a culture there where the staff, the shelter assistants, those folks who are doing, the direct care, and the case managers, bringing them together as one, to see that each and every staff person has a role, a key role to play in helping folks move out of the shelter as quickly as possible, so that all conversations are about housing and focusing on housing and goals, so that everyone feels like they have a part in, and it's not just I'm here to hand out sheets, or I'm here to make sure that, this really drunk guy can get in and out of the shower safely. It's not just that. It's not a us and them. It's a we, clients and staff together, focusing on this goal. So that, yes, is very much a part of changing the culture and getting everyone working in the same direction.
Thank you. That's really helpful. Deirdre, did you have anything to add about how your staff felt at the beginning of this process?
Oh, I think our 2 other speakers have covered it well, but I agree with what you just said. I think that the actual shelter staff were very concerned it would just become a free-for-all, which it hardly is at all. I mean, it isn't at all. So I think that our transitions were very similar.
Thank you. So a question I'll start with you, Deirdre, then for this one. How did your outcomes for clients change after you transitioned to this new housing-focused low-barrier shelter model?
Amazing outcome change, because as we talked before about our collaborations and partnerships with others, so we've had a tremendous success rate of housing our residents at the shelter more quickly into housing, and it's very uplifting for everyone in the shelter to see, that you're not there for up to a year. Sometimes, we're moving people along within 3 to 4 months, and certainly our metrics report shows those statistics of great improvement, and I think it's also showing the community a wonderful transparency on our part, where we're really letting folks know, so it opens up doors for new landlords and others, employers, to help those in the shelter get that foot up into a new life.
And Deirdre, I know that you actually used the shelter metrics that we had recommended, and that you originally were you were collecting a lot of data on, bed nights and meal served and how many people you were serving, which was helpful to you for your funders. And I know you really switched over to looking at things like housing exits and people coming back and length of stay. And so how did that collecting that kind of data, how did that change how you did things in your shelter?
Oh, it really helps, and at staff meetings, particularly with my case managers, I mean, we're reviewing that all the time. What's the length of stay of people, and where are they in the process? And I mean, we record bed nights now just because it's the old history, but we're really educating our funders that this is what we should be looking at as well. And I expect the report we do at the 15th of every month for the prior month, and I present it to the board of directors now every month. So it holds us to a higher expectation as well as to all that we can do and who we can connect people to. But it is about length of stay, how many have entered, how many exited into permanent housing destination, how many left with a not positive exit, which is very few, very few.
And I think I remember your staff early on saying, and understandably being nervous, saying we couldn't possibly increase our exits to permanent housing. We don't have housing in our community, and we couldn't possibly, reduce length of stay. That's just not going to be a possibility, but you did.
Oh my gosh! I mean, some of us do have, you get in the case where they have to be homeless up to a year before they fit any program for subsidized housing programs. But we had some people like 283 days, and now, I mean, we're usually at 40 some days to 70 days is more the norm, and so it just the length of stay has just dramatically changed with this new system. It's wonderful. The low barrier system is certainly working for us.
And how did you get the length of stay to go down?
I think that truly it's the collaborations and partnerships with other agencies that we work with, those that work in housing, those that work to Department of Labor, another organization, we have New Opportunities that helps people looking at different culture groups, who to reach out to. So I think our network has gotten much stronger. There's a greater strength. And we're working, I think it's also working with our own CAN network. We're active in that. My case managers work there 2 days a month doing intake.
And that's your coordinated access network, right?
Yes, and that's where folks go to do their intake and their VI SPDAT as well. We have facilities for showering and doing laundry as well. But my staff are over there, so they really have their pulse on the homeless that are not connected yet into a shelter or into a housing. And so I just think that we are better networked, and people are understanding our goals at the shelter to house people. And so it's really become a team effort in the community, and as well as our politicians, our government officials. I don't know, I feel there's a greater ownership of people caring about the homeless, and certainly I think our metrics reports and working with, I do a lot with cable television shows and radio and newspaper articles, and I think people are taking a greater interest. Facebook, and we try to use websites and other media to get the word out.
Yeah, and I think I want to say, from just observing your transition through this process, I think also one of the things that I really noticed is that the way you were educating your community also helped them understand kind of what your focus was. And I think a lot of people out there ask, well, how can we possibly you know, how can these outcomes happen so quickly? 3 to 6 months, how is that possible? I mean, you doubled the number of people I think you were housing by the end of the 6 months, and you were able to serve more people more quickly because people were coming through more quickly, which was freeing up beds. So your wait lists were reduced. And I think my observation is that it was really just changing your focus to, okay, our goal is to house folks and to get them into permanent housing, and shelter is not a destination, it's a process to get them housed. And it seems like, to me, it seemed like your staff sort of change and the cultural change in the whole shelter, changing just that focus is what really kind of helped too to sort of decrease your length of stay, because people felt like, oh, this is actually a place where it's a part of a process to get me housed. It's not where I should be staying for, you know, almost a year. I thought that was just an amazing change to watch. So thank you for
that's so true, Cynthia, because when people come in, that's the first thing we talk about, and every time we talk to them, how's it going? You know, you've gotten the voucher, how's the plan to move? Who's your, you know, counselor working with you from a program, whatever. So that's the major focus, working with everybody individually. And it excites people because it shows hope. It's all about their hope now to move into independent living.
Thank you. So Kris, I'm going to ask you the same questions. I know you have a lot of data that you collect. So I'm curious how your outcomes for clients changed after you transitioned to this model, and kind of how data helped you get there.
So, and we'll see that again as we look at a little bit later in terms of really changing the staffing model. But you know, I was just pulling up to see our 2016 numbers, which we haven't posted yet. But so I have my 2015 numbers in front of me, but and just know that the 2016 numbers are better. But we had a 59% increase in our housing placement over 2 years of both single adults and our families. And the bigger question is how many of them actually stay housed. And so to say, were you able to meet your outcomes? Because the last thing we want to do is get people into housing and then they are not successful and come back through the front door. And so we had a 97% success rate on people retaining their housing for a 2-year period. So 2 years before that. But I want to say this, that in terms of when you're switching your model and you're going from one model to the other, and you're really focused on getting people housed more quickly, then the goal isn't about getting in and actually fixing people, because people aren't necessarily there to be fixed. It's simply about getting people in and finding the best housing and the most appropriate housing for them, and then getting them connected as quickly as possible. And so when the focus changes and that staff culture changes, which, by the way, staff culture is probably one of the most important components in this, because they drive, they're the drivers behind the actual action plans taking place. And so, you know, it's critically important that they're on board with this, because when they are, you can see that that families and individuals are moving very, very quickly into housing. And so Los Angeles right now has a 2% vacancy rate. I know on the family side last year we placed over 300 families into permanent housing. But even more importantly is that on the front end, when families are coming through, we no longer have a wait list for any of the shelters in our region. And so if families present themselves as not having a place to stay that particular night, we will find them a place to stay that night, whether that be in one of our own beds, one of our provider beds, or in a motel, until we can get them connected. But our focus has changed so that we are really working with those people in our shelter environment to get them connected as quickly as possible, or matched as quickly as possible to the most appropriate housing intervention from them. And our in 2015, which our numbers are from where I'm still operating right now, we were able to do that in 52 days in Los Angeles. And we're, you know, just a little caveat on top, not only do we have a really extremely low vacancy rate, which I know a lot of people are feeling the pressure of across the country, but we have a very expensive housing market. And so if we're able to get that done without, as you said with the other two colleagues on the line, without adding additional resources, there's no reason we can't all step up and get this done. It's just really creating the culture change. It's about reducing the barriers to allow people in, and it's about refocusing what our goals are once people are in our shelter environment working with us.
I want to just re-emphasize the data you just gave us. That you, on average, in LA, which is one of the worst housing markets in the country, in terms of expensiveness and vacancy rate, that you are housing people on average as of 2015 in 52 days. I mean, that is incredible. And with a 59% increase in how many people you're housing, and a 97% are of people staying housed 2 years after, that's incredible. And the reason I wanted to sort of highlight those again is to say, we hear a lot of people ask us, well, aren't we setting people up to fail? There's very little housing, and there's no, not a lot of our folks are going to get rapid rehousing resources or any rental subsidy. They're really just going to be working on what they have, what little income they have, what they can scrape together. So aren't we setting people up to fail if we're putting them into housing, quickly? And I was wondering what your response would be to that.
I think it's critically important to understand the people that you're working with, and to make sure that you're looking at all the factors on the front end. So in LA, we're housing lots and lots of people without any income or only welfare income, and so what we're not doing is saying you don't have the income to sustain it today. What we're looking at more is about what your projected income is tomorrow or the day after that, and really working around that and trying to get you up to that, and then housing you in housing that we know that after our intervention, whether that be for the majority is a very short-term intervention or very short-term subsidy, that they will be able to take it over. And so we're really focusing a lot of our resources now on the back end, on the stabilization component, and ensuring that we're working diligently to get people to what that projected income is. And so I know this in LA for a very long time. When we first started with our coordinated entry, particularly in the family system, we were moving people in at really high rates, and we were all happy about and cheering about that, but what we weren't necessarily paying attention to was the back end. And we very quickly realized that the back end is of equal importance, if not greater importance, because otherwise, if we're not paying attention to the back end, then we're just reclogging the front end and losing landlords along the way, because people are going to fall out of housing. And so we quickly changed our focus, and we're able to adapt to that. But I will say that if you're looking at what people potentially could be making, or what their outcomes in terms of income could be, or if they need permanent supportive housing, you're assessing them correctly and continuing to work with them once placed, then the success will definitely show in the data. And I wanted and prior to that, when we were just operating shelter and keeping people in for up to 24 months, somebody said, Deirdre said 246 days. I can completely, I was right there. I think we were even higher. I think we were closer to 368 days was our average for a long time. But to get away from that and to be able to see that people have the 368 days of success in their own place, then just opens up the front door for people to be able to be quickly placed.
And I mean, what you want to reemphasize, you're talking about shelter being connected to housing. I mean, I think whenever we're talking to communities about thinking about their shelter integrated into a system, shelter, you have to be able to get in to shelter, and you want that's the low barrier part, and you have to be able to get out to housing, right? So that back end piece that you're talking about is critical. And I know that the three panelists on the phone and many communities that are listening, not everyone is going to get a subsidy. Not everyone is going to get permanent supportive housing. And so if we're putting people on lists for permanent supportive housing, they could be there for a really long time. And so we have to always kind of, as challenging as it is, be creative and look at the next best available resource, or what can this, a lot of the folks that you serve are incredibly resilient. And I think that the staff, I hear from staff that, believing that they're setting their clients up for success with whatever tools they have, even if they can't get that voucher, makes a big difference in that family and individual's life in terms of figuring out how to make it, even if they're not going to get access to a particular kind of resource that would be helpful. So,
well, and also, sorry, Cynthia, but I think the other thing to not forget is that people are extremely resilient, and so once we can get them in, I mean, it's a partnership. It goes back to the partnership of us not, as staff fixing or doing things for them, but it's working alongside of them, the participants that we're working with to make sure that they get to where they want to be.
Absolutely. I think that's such an important point. All right, thank you, Kris. I'm going to move on to a question that we have gotten from the audience who answered the survey, and this is just actually summarizing, I think, so many people's questions about how to work with folks who have substance use challenges when you're going low barrier. So this is a direct quote from someone who answered the question. For us, the challenge for low barrier shelter is having a shelter located in a facility where we also have offices, youth programs, recovery programming, and having people who are actively using and in the building at the same time. So it seems as though when we have people who are high or intoxicated, we have problems with quote-unquote aggression and violence and have to call the police. We don't require people to stop using, only that you can't come in high or intoxicated, and that's because of our setting. I think if we have a separate facility, I don't think the low barrier shelter would be an issue. And I think what this question is really asking is, do we need a separate facility? Do we need to separate people out? How do we have people who are using and not using in the same space, individuals and families with kids? How do we do that and keep people safe? And so I'm going to start with John on this question.
Well, as I mentioned earlier, we do at our main facility have all of that. We have families here. Our family overflow is here. So if a family walks in at 10 o'clock in the evening, they'll stay here. And if all of our family facilities are full, they may be here for a few days before we're able to move them into one of the family shelters. So we have families here. We have people in recovery here. We have housing here. We have 192 units of housing on site at our main facility. So juggling these things is an incredible challenge. So I would say that safety is an enormous part of what you have to think about, but also think about you're not the only provider in town and you don't have to be everything to everyone. So if you've got someone who is in one of your shelter programs and is trying to stay sober, trying to find a facility, another provider where he or she can go and get more focused substance use services is perhaps the way to go. To look at harm reduction as a really important ingredient in your intervention, that looking at those folks who are coming in, who are regular users, looking at having those conversations with folks around, okay, maybe a half gallon is, going to prevent you from being able to be here every night, so what about a fifth? What about a pint? And having your shelter staff engaging with folks in those kinds of conversations. And recognizing that you're not going to solve everything, that there will be, some unpleasantness now and then, and looking to the folks, all of your clients, all of your staff, and recognizing that, sometimes things are going to happen and you're going to do the best you can. You're going to keep safety as out there at the forefront, but to also recognize that you've got to communicate and be transparent to folks to say, this is who needs the services. These high acuity folks aren't going to stop overnight just because you make changes in your rules and your policies. So you have to educate everyone who's coming through the door about this is what you're going to find here, and we're going to move you out as quickly as possible. That's our goal, and sometimes that's an important motivator in the conversation.
Thank you, John. I know all of you serve families, but Kris, in LA, I know you have families with children and kind of mixed in with different populations, and I think that's a big concern for people around substance use. So how would you respond to a question like this?
So in terms of allowing people in that are using or intoxicated, even where there's children involved, it is, again, it depends on, for us, we assess each one of these types of episodes independently of one another because it's different. And so in LA, the majority of our families, though, are not necessarily in the same space as individuals. They're in, families are separated from other people, but we have lots of family members that come in from time to time extremely intoxicated. We have space for the family members to go and kind of just hang out either in the courtyard or inside. We have private rooms. We also have the living room where we'll keep people in one of our facilities, or conference rooms, or in the computer lab, so to speak, or let them kind of work it off. But we typically do not disallow people from coming in, or we do not turn people away because they come in higher intoxicated because there's kids there, unless the situation revolves around safety and security of other people, meaning that the people are exhibiting behaviors that we cannot control. They're breaking things or they're acting violent in nature. And so, I mean, that's my only response to that. We have spaces for people to be where at least they're safe, because leaving them outside, lots of different things can happen to them. And also we have lots of teenage kids, older teenage kids that are part of our families that we just don't want to be outside because they came in intoxicated. I hope I answered.
Did you give your staff particular training around this?
Yeah, I mean, we have lots and lots of training. I mean, our training budget in LA is probably one of, or at least for LA family housing, is probably one of the most expensive line items we have. And because we understand that if we're working with people with lots of different issues and barriers and challenges, that we need to be able to provide a level of training and understanding for our team members to be able to manage that, both from a personal perspective and also from a professional perspective. And so we bring in lots of different harm reduction type models, and again, trauma-informed care, and being able to address it from that. But having training and exposing our staff to the way that other communities and the way that other providers work has definitely helped. And getting them to
yeah, I think that's really helpful. I'm going to just move to the next slide to kind of, it's a similar vein of questions, because I wanted to address the part about the previous question that asked about, well, we have recovery programming here, and how do we kind of figure that out? If you have a shelter or a larger program that has an actual drug and alcohol treatment program component, that's like a different program in your group of programs, that's sort of a thing that maybe needs to be separate. However, we get a lot of questions from people in shelters who are saying, well, no, we are keeping people sober in our shelter. That's how a lot of people tell us that they're staying sober in our shelter. And so how can we, keep people sober, and how do we not jeopardize their sobriety if we're going to serve people with different needs, and how do we keep people safe? And I just wanted to say our response and this is from my working in a drug and alcohol treatment program a long time ago myself, and also talking to a lot of recovery specialists and harm reduction specialists, which is shelter really isn't designed to keep people sober, and people who think that their shelter is really keeping people sober without actually providing real treatment and counseling around that, it's really kind of I would say it's not exactly what's happening, because people are, as if anyone's in sobriety, is in recovery, or knows someone in recovery, shelter is not what's keeping them sober. It's really like the work that they're doing on their sobriety, and they should strengthen their sobriety in other ways, and they should get housed as quickly as possible. Shelter is not really a drug and alcohol treatment program. And for folks out there that feel like they are, I think you have to decide: are we a drug and alcohol treatment program, or are we a shelter? So I want to turn it over to you all again to talk about how do you about this question about keeping people sober and jeopardizing their sobriety. I don't know, John, if you want to jump in on this.
Absolutely, and I want to say strongly that I agree with what you just said 150%. An emergency shelter is an emergency shelter. Get people who are, working on their recovery into housing, and provide those supports to help them do that in their housing. But emergency shelters aren't a place for people to get sober. And that's just something that we have to, and that, staff had to come on board and say, yeah, you know what, if someone is working on their sobriety, great, but let's recognize that we also have people who are using, and just because this person is trying to stay clean doesn't mean this person is going to stop using. So I agree. You got to get them housed as quickly as possible, and recognize what is your function. Your function is, an emergency shelter, get folks housed as quickly as possible, then provide those services based on, what the client's needs are and what they want to do, but don't focus on, oh my goodness, how can we possibly have these two populations commingling and have any success? Focus on the housing.
Thank you so much for that really helpful answer. I think we could spend a whole hour on this subject.
Oh yeah.
But there's a whole many hours, and maybe we should do that in a future webinar. But I do want to get to a couple other really key questions that I know that you all have some good advice on, which is a lot of questions we got was inadequate staff. One of our biggest challenges this person is having adequate staff and balancing low barrier shelter with keeping individuals focused on housing and not allowing sites to get institutionalized in shelter. This person says we have many more clients that we can effectively case manage. So naturally, we're clients are sort of getting ingrained in the shelter system before staff is really able to build a housing plan. They're not able to kind of address their housing right away when they walk in the door. So that makes it more difficult. And so how do we make these changes with no extra resources? And so I'm going to turn to Deirdre on this one because I know you really didn't have any extra resources here.
In fact, we experienced a major budget cut from our on the government level. It was reworking staff and also focusing the case management on housing first. We're a supportive model, so we bring in, I have facilities for the workshops we do life skill workshops, that kind of thing. But the case, I as executive make sure that happens, but our case managers are completely focused on working on the housing, developing the goal chart with people on what their life plan will be and what resources they need to succeed once they leave us, and how can we do all that connecting and networking. It was just a new plan of work for us, a new way of work, and not getting involved in everybody's individual lives, just being focused on what their futures will be. And we bring others in to work, as I've shared before, from other agencies and organizations, and we provide space for them to meet with the shelter residents. But as far as our own case management, we're just very focused now on housing. And we receive no funding for this at all.
Yeah, and you have
just
very little
staff. Right.
Yeah.
Very little staff.
And kind of, it's sort of not about doing more duties, but really changing the focus of the activities you're already doing. And I know, Kris, Kris in LA, you really changed your entire staffing. So I wanted to give you a chance to kind of talk through that. And on this slide, we kind of see your old org chart, and then we'll work through to your new one.
Okay. So I think our old org chart looks like lots of different people's current org charts, or similar, at least in style. And the one that I'm about to show you, ours doesn't exactly look like that, but it's more about functionality. And so before it used to be, you have your CEO, and then beneath that you have your homeless programs, or you might have a development team, but specifically around the homeless programs. In those homeless programs, you might have temporary shelter and permanent housing, and all the and then under them you have a level of different teams. If you can hit the next slide, Cynthia. And so the new org chart. So this is being a little bit facetious, like I said, but essentially I think it represents more along the lines of what we've done. And so what we're talking about in the new org chart is really doing things by function. And so functions meaning engagement, which could be in-reach or outreach, housing navigation or coordination, which is pretty much everything post-engagement, but everything pre-housed. Housing location being its own separate entity, which really isn't about support service. It's more about having a salesperson or people that understand the real estate market and or the asset that that apartments and housing just are in general to the owners of those units, and what that means. And then, of course, the housing stabilization team, which is everything post-house. Having and building a data team is critically important, because it's not just about data entry anymore and putting in a bunch of stuff into HMIS, but it's really about being able to step back and look at performance and be able to analyze and have whatever it is that you're analyzing drive decisions in terms of how you move forward with creating and implementing programs. It should be data-driven, not just an anecdotal guess about what you need programmatically. And then, of course, you have the pig, which Cynthia put as a slacker and a complainer and unskilled. I actually refer to the pig as being super sweet and not skilled, but they're those people that you have on your team that really love this work because they want to help, but they don't have the skill set to be able to help, and so they're really creating more of a roadblock than getting you to where you need to be. And then back to the very beginning, which is the director level and or manager level, but being able to provide a level of support for each of the teams. I remember there was a time when I had like 60 plus people and resident advocates, which I don't have here, but resident advocates and security, which also fell underneath me. So I was hitting upward of 100 people. There was no way that I could provide them with the direct supervision that they needed. And so it was creating different levels within our agency to be able to provide staff the real support that they needed to be able to deal with the issues that come up just in day-to-day work with the clientele that we have, and to provide good and positive feedback about steps that need to be taken to get people from homelessness into housing, and then helping them stay there. But the key component here is that we were able to redo all of this within our own agency without getting any additional resources. This was all done by leveraging existing contracts that we had, and then just stepping back and say, what do we need? How do we function as an agency? What are the different buckets that we have? And then putting people in those buckets using our current resources. And instead of saying you work as a caseworker or a case manager for the VA program, or you work as a case as a stabilizer or as a caseworker for the new lease program, it's that you work under family coordinated entry, and your role is a housing stabilizer. And it doesn't matter where you get funded from, because if you were to ask our staff today where their funding comes from, they have no idea. They're given a number to bill to, but they have zero idea what that means. They just know what function they fall under. And that was all done by just stepping back, seeing what we needed, and then reorganizing it to make sense so that everyone was being able to give additional support. Then, as new contracts came in, we were able to fill the gaps that we identified from operating under the new functional model, seeing that, you know what, stabilization was something that we weren't paying attention to, and that really in our shelter system, we didn't need to have a high level of case management staff, because our coordinated entry in LA manages all the housing components. So we were able to reduce our costs of the shelter by bringing in resident advocates that deal with the day-to-day crises, but that also work in collaboration with the coordinated entry to help people quickly go through shelter into permanent housing. That's a really quick snapshot.
This is Deirdre. I want to just add something. It's overwhelming comparing LA with our little rural 35-bed shelter. So for those out there listening, there's other ways around using all these wonderful components that Kris has. We have other organizations that write grants to work for us, and they are coming in and providing a lot of the services that I'm seeing listed. So there are clever ways you can work around this.
Right, 100%. And I realize that not every agency or community might have the ability to do this on their own, but it's about then leveraging what you have with your partner and collaborating agencies in the community. And a really good example of that is like an employment person per se, is that we all know that in rapid rehousing particularly, employment and an increase in people's income is incredibly important, but we're not necessarily specialists at that. There's people in the community that are already funded to do that, and so we shouldn't be bringing in people on our own team to do that. We should be working with the people that do that. And so we were able to save money by getting rid of some of the positions that we had and restructuring it to make sense without actually having to lay anybody off.
Yeah, and I think it's so great to have both of you kind of give your perspective on this, because you're on such opposite ends of the spectrum, and that it's really, I think both the key takeaways I'm hearing also are, you know, looking at what you have and doing differently with it, and being really creative about how you kind of think about what is actually needed, and also just certainly partnerships, and that coordinated entry, if I know it's not in everyone's communities, but it will eventually save you some staff resources. And I just think this is incredibly helpful to think through this way. And so we only have a few more minutes, and I want to get to an important question that I know we've gotten from a lot of folks, which is board buy-in. We want to move to a low barrier model, but our board sometimes lacks understanding of what that means. For instance, there's been a long-standing wants and warrants check at intake, and we want to discard that, but the board believes the policy offers safety and protects us from liability. We hear a lot about this building liability. And Deirdre, I wanted to turn this over to you because I know you've done a lot of work with your board.
That we have, and I think that the shock that they had of thinking of going low barrier and their reaction, and then when I held that community meeting with the leaders of our community and funders of our organization, that did the trick, because we had the presenters from both the Connecticut Coalition End Homelessness and the Department of Housing at the meeting, answering questions, reassuring, but what was most reassuring was that we were fortunately already working with the National Alliance as a shelter, and so our own staff were able to say, this is working, we've already sort of been transitioning into it, and it works. So that was very reassuring, but definitely I thought we might end up with some resignations on the board. We did not, because you know, I invited them in, and you make them a part of the process as I redid all of our policies and rules and explain the process and the new function of just focusing on housing. I mean, they get it now, and I think they take pride in how quickly we did transition into the low barrier model.
That's incredibly helpful. And I think, John, I also heard you talk about getting your board on at the beginning.
Yes, that was one of the first things that we did, was have Ian from OrgCode come in and do a presentation to the board and really answer each and every question that they had and address all of their concerns right at the beginning, so that we knew that each and every person on the board understood that this was not going to cause the agency to be sued each and every other day. So it was important to do that education, to do that upfront work, to get them to be, you know, right there with us and understand that this was not only going to be successful, but was going to be highly successful. And I just want to add from the previous conversation that Kris and that we all know, no one has enough staff and no one has enough housing, but clearly defining what your objective is, what your function is, and aligning your resources to that can get you there.
That's a fantastic last message, John. And I know we're a little bit over time, but I wanted to give the panelists an opportunity to share any last words that you would recommend to shelters who are approaching this process.
I would say that as in my executive director role, that I'm out promoting all the time homeless issues to every avenue, every media source I can talk to. So be your best storyteller, because success, I think, really breeds success, and it really opens your agency in serving the homeless to giving ownership to the greater community.
If we work east to west, I'll go next. I would say that if you recognize working with the highest acuity folks, the most needy first, and focusing on that, recognizing that you're not going to be able to provide case management to everyone, that people are resilient, and many folks will resolve their homelessness on their own, that you will focus your resources in the right place and have the best outcomes.
And for me, because they've already said everything, I'm just going to say that creating a new culture within your team will help get you to where you need to get. Our jobs are tough, as Cynthia said in the very, very beginning, but homelessness is solvable, and the first step for many of the people along that path is going to be our emergency response, which tends to be crisis housing or emergency housing. And so if we can get staff on board and work really alongside of the participants and be their colleagues in this process, we definitely can move people quickly through and into permanent housing.
Well, I couldn't ask for a more inspiring way to end this webinar. I want to thank the panelists. You have your experience is amazing and so invaluable. Thank you so much for sharing it. I have a feeling you might be getting questions from around the country, and I apologize for that. But I think your experience is invaluable. Thank you so much for guiding so many people across the country across your through your process, and we really appreciate your time. And I want to just quickly point out that next we will have a webinar in early August. We'll be taking July off because we have our national conference in Washington, D.C. So if you're going to be there, we look forward to seeing you. Otherwise, please check our website. We will have our next webinar in August. If you have any questions, you can reach us at the center at naeh.org. And we thank you for attending the webinar. We hope to hear from you soon.